Chapter 67 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1, by Tobias Smollett. Chapter 67. Sees his sister happily married. Visits Emilia, who receives him according to his deserts. Her brother, being of opinion that Mr. Clover's proposal was not to be neglected, especially as Julia's heart was engaged in his favour, communicated the affair to his uncle, who, with the approbation of Mrs. Trunnion, declared himself well satisfied with the young man's addresses, and desired that they might be buckled with all expedition, without the knowledge or concurrence of her parents, to whom, on account of their unnatural barbarity, she was not bound to pay the least regard. Though our adventurer entertained the same sentiments of the matter, and the lover, dreading some obstruction, earnestly begged the immediate condescension of his mistress, she could not be prevailed upon to take such a material step without having first solicited the permission of her father, resolved, nevertheless, to comply with the dictates of her own heart, should his objections be frivolous or unjust. Urged by this determination, her admirer waited upon Mr. Gamaliel at the public house, and, with the appearance of great deference and respect, made him acquainted with his affection for his daughter, communicated the particulars of his fortune, with the terms of settlement he was ready to make, and, in conclusion, told him that he would marry her without a portion. This last offer seemed to have some weight with the father, who received it with civility, and promised in a day or two to favour him with a final answer to his demand. He accordingly that same evening consulted his wife, who, being exasperated at the prospect of her daughter's independency, argued with the most virulent expostulation against the match, as an impudent scheme of her own planning, with a view of insulting her parents, towards whom she had already been guilty of the most vicious disobedience. In short, she used such remonstrances as not only averted this weak husband's inclination from the proposal which he had relished before, but even instigated him to apply for a warrant to apprehend his daughter, on the supposition that she was about to bestow herself in marriage without his privity or consent. The justice of the peace, to whom this application was made, though he could not refuse the order, yet being no stranger to the malevolence of the mother, which, together with Gamaliel's simplicity, was notorious in the county, he sent an intimation of what had happened to the garrison, upon which a couple of sentinels were placed on the gate, and at the pressing solicitation of the lover, as well as the desire of the commodore, her brother and aunt, Julia was wedded without further delay, the ceremony being performed by Mr. Jolter, because the parish priest prudently declined any occasion of giving offence, and the curate was too much in the interest of their enemies to be employed in that office. This domestic concern being settled to the satisfaction of our hero, he escorted her next day to the house of her husband, who immediately wrote a letter to her father, declaring his reasons for having thus superseded his authority, and Mistress Pickle's mortification was unspeakable. That the new married couple might be guarded against all insult, our young gentleman and his friend Hatchway, with their adherents, lodged in Mr. Clover's house for some weeks, during which they visited their acquaintance in the neighbourhood, according to custom. When the tranquillity of their family was perfectly established, and the contract of the marriage executed in the presence of the old commodore and his lady, who gave her niece £500 to purchase jewels and clothes, Mr. Peregrine could no longer restrain his impatience to see his dear Emily, and told his uncle that next day he proposed to ride across the country, in order to visit his friend Gauntlet, whom he had not heard of for a long time. The old gentleman, looking steadfastly in his face, "Ah, damn your cunning," said he, "I find the anchor holds fast. I did suppose as how you would have slipped your cable and changed your berth; but I see when a young fellow is once brought up by a pretty wench, he may man his capstans and viol block if he will, but he'll as soon heave up the pike of Teneriffe as bring his anchor away. Odds heart likins! Had I known the young woman was Ned Gauntlet's daughter, I shouldn't have thrown out signal for leaving off chase." Our adventurer was not a little surprised to hear the commodore talk in this style, and immediately conjectured that his friend Godfrey had informed him of the whole affair. Instead of listening to this approbation of his flame with those transports of joy which he would have felt, had he retained his former sentiments, he was chagrined at Trunnion's declaration, and offended at the presumption of the young soldier in presuming to disclose the secret with which he had entrusted him. Reddening with these reflections, he assured the commodore that he never had serious thoughts of matrimony, so that if any person had told him he was under any engagement of that kind, he had abused his ear, for he protested that he would never contract such attachments without his knowledge and express permission. Trunnion commended him for his prudent resolution, and observed that, though no person mentioned to him what promises had passed betwixt him and his sweetheart, it was very plain that he had made love to her, and therefore it was to be supposed that his intentions were honourable, for he could not believe he was such a rogue in his heart as to endeavour to debauch the daughter of a brave officer, who had served his country with credit and reputation. Notwithstanding this remonstrance, which Pickle imputed to the commodore's ignorance of the world, he set out for the habitation of Mistress Gauntlet, with the unjustifiable sentiments of a man of pleasure, who sacrifices every consideration to the desire of his ruling appetite; and as Winchester lay in his way, resolved to visit some of his friends who lived in that place. It was in the house of one of these that he was informed of Emilia's being then in town with her mother, upon which he excused himself from staying to drink tea, and immediately repaired to their lodgings, according to the directions he had received. When he arrived at the door, instead of undergoing that perturbation of spirits which a lover in his interesting situation might be supposed to feel, he suffered no emotion but that of vanity and pride, favoured with an opportunity of self-gratification, and entered his Emilia's apartment with the air of a conceited petit maître, rather than that of a respectable admirer when he visits the object of his passion, after an absence of 17 months. The young lady, having been very much disobliged at his mortifying neglect of her brother's letter, had summoned all her own pride and resolution to her aid, and by means of a happy disposition so far overcame her chagrin at his indifference, that she was able to behave in his presence with apparent tranquillity and ease. She was even pleased to find that he had by accident chosen a time for his visit when she was surrounded by 2 or 3 young gentlemen, who professed themselves her admirers. Our gallant was no sooner announced than she collected all her coquetry, put on the gayest air she could assume, and contrived to giggle just as he appeared at the room door. The compliments of salutation being performed, she welcomed him to England in a careless manner, asking the news of Paris, and before he could make any reply, desired one of the other gentlemen to proceed with the sequel of that comical adventure, in the relation of which he had been interrupted. Peregrine smiled within himself at this behaviour, which, without all doubt, he believed she had affected to punish him for his unkind silence while he was abroad, being fully persuaded that her heart was absolutely at his devotion. On this supposition, he practised his Parisian improvements on the art of conversation, and uttered 1,000 prettinesses in the way of compliment, with such incredible rotation of tongue, that his rivals were struck dumb with astonishment, and Emilia fretted out of all temper at seeing herself deprived of the prerogative of the sex. He persisted, however, in this surprising loquacity, until the rest of the company thought proper to withdraw, and then contracted his discourse into the focus of love, which now put on a very different appearance from that which it had formerly worn. Instead of awful veneration, which her presence used to inspire, that chastity of sentiment and delicacy of expression, he now gazed upon her with the eyes of a libertine. He glowed with the impatience of desire, talked in a strain that barely kept within the bounds of decency, and attempted to snatch such favours as she, in the tenderness of mutual acknowledgments, had once vouchsafed to bestow. Grieved and offended as she was at this palpable alteration in his carriage, she disdained to remind him of his former deportment, and with dissembled good humour rallied him on the progress he had made in gallantry and address. But far from submitting to the liberties he would have taken, she kept her person sacred from his touch, and would not even suffer him to ravish a kiss of her fair hand, so that he reaped no other advantage from the exercise of his talents during this interview, which lasted a whole hour, than that of knowing he had overrated his own importance, and that Emily's heart was not a garrison likely to surrender at discretion. At length his addresses were interrupted by the arrival of the mother, who had gone abroad to visit by herself; and the conversation becoming more general, he understood that Godfrey was at London, soliciting for a lieutenancy that had fallen vacant in the regiment to which he belonged, and that Miss Sophy was at home with her father. Though our adventurer had not met with all the success he expected by his first visit, he did not despair of reducing the fortress, believing that in time there would be a mutiny in his favour, and accordingly carried on the siege for several days, without profiting by his perseverance, till at length, having attended the ladies to their own house in the country, he began to look upon this adventure as time misspent, and resolved to discontinue his attack, in hopes of meeting with a more favourable occasion, being, in the meantime, ambitious of displaying in a higher sphere those qualifications which his vanity told him were at present misapplied. Chapter 67. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 68 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1, by Tobias Smollett. Chapter 68. He attends his uncle with great affection during a fit of illness, sets out again for London, meets with his friend Godfrey, who is prevailed upon to accompany him to Bath, on the road to which place they chance to dine with a person who entertains them with a curious account of a certain company of adventurers. Thus determined, he took leave of Emilia and her mother, on pretence of going to London upon some urgent business, and returned to the garrison, leaving the good old lady very much concerned, and the daughter incensed at his behaviour, which was the more unexpected, because Godfrey had told them that the commodore approved of his nephew's passion. Our adventurer found his uncle so ill of the gout, which for the first time had taken possession of his stomach, that his life was in imminent danger, and the whole family in disorder. He therefore took the reins of government in his own hands, sent for all the physicians in the neighbourhood, and attended him in person with the most affectionate care during the whole fit, which lasted a fortnight, and then retired before the strength of his constitution. When the old gentleman recovered his health, he was so penetrated with Peregrine's behaviour, that he actually would have made over to him his whole fortune, and depended upon him for his own subsistence, Had not our youth opposed the execution of the deed with all his influence and might, and even persuaded him to make a will, in which his friend Hatchway and all his other adherents were liberally remembered, and his aunt provided for on her own terms. This material point being settled, he, with his uncle's permission, departed for London, after having seen the family affairs established under the direction and administration of Mr. Jolter and the lieutenant; for by this time Mrs. Trunnion was wholly occupied with her spiritual concern. On his first arrival at London, he sent a card to the lodgings of Gauntlet, in consequence of a direction from his mother; and that young gentleman waited on him next morning, though not with that alacrity of countenance and warmth of friendship which might have been expected from the intimacy of their former connection. Nor was Peregrine himself actuated by the same unreserved affection for the soldier which he had formerly entertained. Godfrey, over and above the offence he had taken at Pickle's omission in point of corresponding with him, had been informed by a letter from his mother of the youth's cavalier behaviour to Emilia during his last residence at Winchester; and our young gentleman, as we have already observed, was disgusted at the supposed discovery which the soldier had made in his absence to the commodore. They perceived their mutual umbrage at meeting, and received each other with that civility of reserve which commonly happens between two persons whose friendship is in the wane. Gauntlet at once divined the cause of the other's displeasure, and in order to vindicate his own character, after the first compliments were passed, took the opportunity, on inquiring after the health of the commodore, to tell Peregrine that, while he tarried at the garrison on his return from Dover, the subject of the conversation one night happening to turn on our hero's passion, the old gentleman had expressed his concern about that affair, and, among other observations, said he supposed the object of his love was some paltry hussy whom he had picked up when he was a boy at school. Upon which Mr. Hatchway assured him that she was a young woman of as good a family as any in the county, and, after having prepossessed him in her favour, ventured, out of the zeal of his friendship, to tell who she was; wherefore the discovery was not to be imputed to any other cause, and he hoped Mr. Pickle would acquit him of all share in the transaction. Peregrine was very well pleased to be thus undeceived; his countenance immediately cleared up, the formality of his behaviour relaxed into his usual familiarity. He asked pardon for his unmannerly neglect of Godfrey's letter, which he protested was not owing to any disregard or abatement of friendship, but to a hurry of youthful engagements, in consequence of which he had procrastinated his answer from time to time, until he was ready to return in person. The young soldier was contented with this apology, and as Pickle's intention, with respect to his sister, was still dubious and undeclared, he did not think it was incumbent upon him, as yet, to express any resentment on that score, but was wise enough to foresee that the renewal of his intimacy with our young gentleman might be the means of reviving that flame which had been dissipated by a variety of new ideas. With those sentiments he laid aside all reserve, and their communication resumed its former channel. Peregrine made him acquainted with all the adventures in which he had been engaged since their parting; and he, with the same confidence, related the remarkable incidents of his own fate, among other things, giving him to understand that, upon obtaining a commission in the army, the father of his dear Sophy, without once inquiring about the occasion of his promotion, had not only favoured him with his countenance in a much greater degree than heretofore, but also contributed his interest, and even promised the assistance of his purse, in procuring for him a lieutenancy, which he was then soliciting with all his power; whereas, if he had not been enabled, by a most accidental piece of good fortune, to lift himself into the sphere of an officer, he had all the reason in the world to believe that this gentleman, and all the rest of his wealthy relations, would have suffered him to languish in obscurity and distress. and by turning his misfortune into reproach, made it a plea for their want of generosity and friendship. Peregrine, understanding the situation of his friend's affairs, would have accommodated him upon the instant with a sum to accelerate the passage of his commission through the offices; but being too well acquainted with his scrupulous disposition to manifest his benevolence in that manner, he found means to introduce himself to one of the gentlemen of the War Office, who was so well satisfied with the arguments used in behalf of his friend, that Godfrey's business was transacted in a very few days, though he himself knew nothing of his interest being thus reinforced. By this time the season at Bath was begun, and our hero, panting with the desire of distinguishing himself at that resort of the fashionable world, communicated his design of going thither to his friend Godfrey, whom he importuned to accompany him in the excursion; and leave of absence from his regiment being obtained by the influence of Peregrine's new quality friends, the two companions departed from London in a post-chaise, attended as usual by the valet de chambre and Pipes, who were become almost as necessary to our adventurer as any two of his own organs. At the inn, when they alighted for dinner, Godfrey perceived a person walking by himself in the yard, with a very pensive air, and upon observing him more narrowly, recognised him to be a professed gamester, whom he had formerly known at Tunbridge. On the strength of this acquaintance, he accosted the peripatetic, who knew him immediately, and in the fullness of his grief and vexation told him that he was now on his return from Bath, where he had been stripped by a company of sharpers, who resented that he should presume to trade upon his own bottom. Peregrine, who was extremely curious in his inquiries, imagining that he might learn some entertaining and useful anecdotes from this artist, invited him to dinner, and was accordingly fully informed of all the political systems at Bath. He understood that there was at London one great company of adventurers who employed agents in all the different branches of imposition throughout the whole kingdom of England, allowing these ministers a certain proportion of the profits accruing from their industry and skill, and reserving the greatest share for the benefit of the common stock, which was chargeable with the expense of fitting out individuals in their various pursuits, as well as with the loss sustained in the course of their adventures. Some whose persons and qualifications are by the company judged adequate to the task, exert their talents in making love to ladies of fortune, being accommodated with money and accoutrements for that purpose, after having given their bonds, payable to one or other of the directors on the day of marriage, for certain sums, proportioned to the dowries they are to receive. Others, versed in the doctrine of chances, and certain secret expediencies, frequent all those places where games of hazard are allowed; and such as are masters in the arts of billiards, tennis, and bowls, are continually lying in wait, in all the scenes of these diversions, for the ignorant and unwary. A fourth class attend horse races, being skilled in those mysterious practices by which the knowing ones are taken in. Nor is this community unfurnished with those who lay wanton wives and old rich widows under contribution, and extort money by prostituting themselves to the embraces of their own sex, and then threatening their admirers with prosecution. But their most important returns are made by that body of their undertakers who exercise their understandings in the innumerable stratagems of the card table, at which no sharper can be too infamous to be received, and even caressed by persons of the highest rank and distinction. Among other articles of intelligence, our young gentleman learned that those agents by whom their guest was broke and expelled from Bath had constituted a bank against all sporters, and monopolised the advantage in all sorts of play, He then told Gauntlet that if he would put himself under his direction, he would return with them, and lay such a scheme as would infallibly ruin the whole society at billiards, as he knew that Godfrey excelled them all in his knowledge of that game. The soldier excused himself from engaging in any party of that kind, and after dinner the travellers parted. But as the conversation between the two friends turned upon the information they had received, Peregrine projected a plan for punishing those villainous pests of society who prey upon their fellow creatures, and it was put in execution by Gauntlet in the following manner. End of chapter 68. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 69 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1, by Tobias Smollett. Chapter 69. Godfrey executes a scheme at Bath, by which a whole company of sharpers is ruined. On the evening after their arrival at Bath, Godfrey, who had kept himself up all day for that purpose, went in boots to the billiard table, and two gentlemen being at play, began to bet with so little appearance of judgment, that one of the adventurers then present was inflamed with a desire of profiting by his inexperience, and when the table was vacant, invited him to take a game for amusement. The soldier, assuming the air of a self-conceited dupe, answered that he did not choose to throw away his time for nothing, but if he pleased would pickle for a crown a game. This declaration was very agreeable to the other, who wanted to be further confirmed in the opinion he had conceived of the stranger, before he would play for anything of consequence. The party being accepted, Gauntlet put off his coat, and beginning with seeming eagerness, won the first game, because his antagonist kept up his play with a view of encouraging him to wager a greater sum. The soldier purposely bit at the hook, the stakes were doubled, and he was again victorious, by the permission of his competitor. He now began to yawn, and observing that it was not worth his while to proceed in such a childish manner, the other swore in an affected passion that he would play him for 20 guineas. The proposal being embraced through the connivance of Godfrey, the money was won by the sharper, who exerted his dexterity to the utmost, fearing that otherwise his adversary would decline continuing the game. Godfrey, thus conquered, pretended to lose his temper, cursed his own ill luck, swore that the table had a cast, and that the balls did not run true, changed his mast, and with great warmth challenged his enemy to double the sum. The gamester, who feigned reluctance, complied with his desire, and having got the first two hazards, offered to lay 100 guineas to 50 on the game. The odds were taken, and Godfrey, having allowed himself to be overcome, began to rage with great violence, broke the mast to pieces, threw the balls out of the window, and in the fury of his indignation defied his antagonist to meet him tomorrow, when he should be refreshed from the fatigue of travelling. This was a very welcome invitation to the gamester, who, imagining that the soldier would turn out a most beneficial prize, assured him that he would not fail to be there next forenoon in order to give him his revenge. Gauntlet went home to his lodgings, fully certified of his own superiority, and took his measures with Peregrine touching the prosecution of their scheme, while his opponent made a report of his success to the brethren of the gang, who resolved to be present at the decision of the match, with a view of taking advantage of the stranger's passionate disposition. Affairs being thus concerted on both sides, the players met according to appointment, and the room was immediately filled with spectators, who either came thither by accident, curiosity, or design. The match was fixed for £100 a game. The principals chose their instruments and laid aside their coats, and one of the knights of the order proffered to lay another 100 on the head of his associate. Godfrey took him up upon the instant. A second worthy of the same class, seeing him so eager, challenged him to treble the sum, and his proposal met with the same reception, to the astonishment of the company, whose expectation was raised to a very interesting pitch. The game was begun, and the soldier having lost the first hazard, the odds were offered by the confederacy with great vociferation. But nobody would run such a risk in favour of a person who was utterly unknown. The sharper having gained the second also, the noise increased to a surprising clamour, not only of the gang, but likewise of almost all the spectators, who desired to lay 2 to 1 against the brother of Emilia. Peregrine, who was present, perceiving the cupidity of the association sufficiently inflamed, all of a sudden opened his mouth and answered their bets to the amount of £1,200, which were immediately deposited on both sides in money and notes, so that this was perhaps the most important game that ever was played at billiards. Gauntlet, seeing the agreement settled, struck his antagonist's ball into the pocket in a twinkling, though it was in one of those situations which are supposed to be against the striker. The bettors were a little discomposed at this event, for which, however, they consoled themselves by imputing the success to accident. But when, at the very next stroke, he sprung it over the table, their countenances underwent an instantaneous distraction of feature, and they waited in the most dreadful suspense for the next hazard, which being likewise taken with infinite ease by the soldier, the blood forsook their cheeks, and the interjection "Zounds!" pronounced with a look of consternation and in a tone of despair, proceeded from every mouth at the same instant of time. They were overwhelmed with horror and astonishment at seeing 3 hazards taken in as many strokes from a person of their friend's dexterity, and shrewdly suspected that the whole was a scheme preconcerted for their destruction. On this supposition they changed the note, and attempted to hedge for their own indemnification, by proposing to lay the odds in favour of Gauntlet; but so much was the opinion of the company altered by that young gentleman's success, that no one would venture to espouse the cause of his competitor, who, chancing to improve his game by the addition of another lucky hit, diminished the concern, and revived the hopes of his adherents. But this gleam of fortune did not long continue. Godfrey collected his whole art and capacity, and augmenting his score to number 10, indulged himself with a view of the whole fraternity. The visages of these professors had adopted different shades of complexion at every hazard he had taken. From their natural colour they had shifted into a sallow hue, from thence into pale, from pale into yellow, which degenerated into a mahogany tint, and now they saw £1,700 of their stock depending upon a single stroke, they stood like so many swarthy Moors, jaundiced with terror and vexation. The fire which naturally glowed in the cheeks and nose of the player seemed utterly extinct, and his carbuncles exhibited a livid appearance, as if a gangrene had already made some progress in his face. His hand began to shake, and his whole frame was seized with such trepidation that he was fain to swallow a bumper of brandy in order to re-establish the tranquillity of his nerves. This expedient, however, did not produce the desired effect, for he aimed the ball at the lead with such discomposure that it struck on the wrong side, and came off at an angle which directed it full into the middle hole. This fatal accident was attended with a universal groan, as if the whole universe had gone to wreck; and notwithstanding that tranquillity for which adventurers are so remarkable, This loss made such an impression upon them all, that each in particular manifested his chagrin by the most violent emotions. One turned up his eyes to heaven and bit his nether lip, another gnawed his fingers while he stalked across the room, a third blasphemed with horrid imprecations, and he who played the party sneaked off, grinding his teeth together with a look that baffles all description, and as he crossed the threshold, exclaiming, "A damned bite, by gad!" The victors, after having insulted them by asking if they were disposed for another chance, carried off their winning with the appearance of great composure, though in their hearts they were transported with unspeakable joy, not so much on account of the booty they had gained, as in consideration of having so effectually destroyed such a nest of pernicious miscreants. Peregrine, believing that now he had found an opportunity of serving his friend, without giving offence to the delicacy of his honour, told him, upon their arrival at their lodgings, that fortune had at length enabled him to become in a manner independent, or at least make himself easy in his circumstances, by purchasing a company with the money he had won. So saying, he put his share of the success in Gauntlet's hand, as a sum that of right belonged to him, and promised to write in his behalf to a nobleman who had interest enough to promote such a quick rise in the service. Godfrey thanked him for his obliging intention, but absolutely refused, with great loftiness of demeanour, to appropriate to his own use any part of the money which Pickle had gained, and seemed affronted at the other's entertaining a sentiment so unworthy of his character. He would not even accept, in the way of loan, such an addition to his own stock as would amount to the price of a company of foot, but expressed great confidence in the future exertion of that talent which had been blessed with such a prosperous beginning. Our hero, finding him thus obstinately deaf to the voice of his own interest, resolved to govern himself in his next endeavours of friendship by his experience of this ticklish punctilio, and in the meantime gave a handsome benefaction to the hospital, out of these first fruits of the success in play, and reserved £200 for a set of diamond earrings and solitaire, which he intended for a present to Miss Emily. End of chapter 69. Recording by Martin Geeson in Haslemere, Surrey. Chapter 70 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1, by Tobias Smollett. Chapter 70. The two friends eclipse all their competitors in gallantry, and practise a pleasant project of revenge upon the physicians of the place. The fame of their exploit against the sharpers was immediately diffused through all the companies at Bath, so that when our adventurers appeared in public, they were pointed out by 100 extended fingers, and considered as consummate artists in all the different species of finesse, which they would not fail to practise with the first opportunity. Nor was this opinion of their characters any obstacle to their reception into the fashionable parties in the place, but, on the contrary, such a recommendation, which, as I have already hinted, never fails to operate for the advantage of the possessor. This first adventure, therefore, served them as an introduction to the company at Bath, who were not a little surprised to find their expectations baffled by the conduct of the two companions, because, far from engaging deeply at play, they rather shunned all occasions of gaming, and directed their attention to gallantry, in which our hero shone unrivalled. His external qualifications, exclusive of any other merit, were strong enough to captivate the common run of the female sex; and these, reinforced with a sprightliness of conversation and a most insinuating address, became irresistible, even by those who were fortified with pride, caution, or indifference. But among all the nymphs of this gay place, he did not meet with one object that disputed the empire of his heart with Emilia, and therefore he divided his attachment according to the suggestions of vanity and whim; so that before he had resided a fortnight at Bath, he had set all the ladies by the ears, and furnished all the 100 tongues of scandal with full employment. The splendour of his appearance excited the inquiries of envy, which, instead of discovering any circumstances to his prejudice, was cursed with the information of his being a young gentleman of a good family, and heir to an immense fortune. The countenance of some of his quality friends, who arrived at Bath, confirmed this piece of intelligence; upon which his acquaintance was courted and cultivated with great assiduity, and he met with such advances from some of the fair sex as rendered him extremely fortunate in his amours. Nor was his friend Godfrey a stranger to favours of the same kind. His accomplishments were exactly calculated for the meridian of female taste; and with certain individuals of that sex, his muscular frame and the robust connection of his limbs were more attractive than the delicate proportions of his companion. He accordingly reigned paramount among those inamoratas who were turned of 30, without being under the necessity of proceeding by tedious addresses, and was thought to have cooperated with the waters in removing the sterility of certain ladies who had long undergone the reproach and disgust of their husbands; while Peregrine set up his throne among those who laboured under the disease of celibacy, from the pert miss of 15, who with a fluttering heart tosses her head, bridles up, and giggles involuntarily at sight of a handsome young man, to the staid maid of 28, who with a demure aspect moralizes on the vanity of beauty, the folly of youth, and simplicity of woman, and expatiates on friendship, benevolence, and good sense, in the style of a Platonic philosopher. In such a diversity of dispositions, his conquests were attended with all the heart-burnings, animosities, and turmoils of jealousy and spite. The younger class took all opportunities of mortifying their seniors in public, by treating them with that indignity which, contrary to the general privilege of age, is, by the consent and connivance of mankind, levelled against those who have the misfortune to come under the denomination of old maids, and these last retorted their hostilities in the private machinations of slander, supported by experience and subtlety of invention. Not one day passed in which some new story did not circulate, to the prejudice of one or other of those rivals. If our hero, in the long room, chanced to quit one of the moralists, with whom he had been engaged in conversation, he was immediately accosted by a number of the opposite faction, who, with ironical smiles, upbraided him with cruelty to the poor lady he had left, exhorted him to have compassion on her sufferings, and, turning their eyes towards the object of their intercession, broke forth into a universal peal of laughter. On the other hand, when Peregrine, in consequence of having danced with one of the minors overnight, visited her in the morning, the Platonists immediately laid hold of the occasion, tasked their imaginations, associated ideas, and with sage insinuations retailed 1,000 circumstances of the interview, which never had any foundation in truth. They observed that if girls are determined to behave with such indiscretion, they must lay their accounts with incurring the censure of the world; that she in question was old enough to act more circumspectly, and wondered that her mother would permit any young fellow to approach the chamber while her daughter was naked in bed. As for the servants peeping through the keyhole, to be sure it was an unlucky accident, that people ought to be on their guard against such curiosity, and give their domestics no cause to employ their penetration. These and other such reflections were occasionally whispered as secrets among those who were known to be communicative, so that in a few hours it became the general topic of discourse; and as it had been divulged under injunctions of secrecy, it was almost impossible to trace the scandal to its origin, because every person concerned must have promulgated her own breach of trust in discovering her author of the report. Peregrine, instead of allaying, rather exasperated this contention by an artful distribution of his attention among the competitors, well knowing that should his regard be converged into one point, he would soon forfeit the pleasure he enjoyed in seeing them at variance, for both parties would join against the common enemy, and his favourite would be persecuted by the whole coalition. He perceived that among the secret agents of scandal, none were so busy as the physicians, a class of animals who live in this place like so many ravens hovering about a carcass, and even ply for employment, like scullers at Hungerford Stairs. The greatest part of them have correspondents in London, who make it their business to inquire into the history, character, and distemper of every one that repairs to Bath for the benefit of the waters; and if they cannot procure interest to recommend their medical friends to these patients before they set out, they at least furnish them with a previous account of what they could collect, that their correspondents may use this intelligence for their own advantage. By these means, and the assistance of flattery and assurance, they often insinuate themselves into the acquaintance of strangers, and by consulting their dispositions become necessary and subservient to their prevailing passions. By their connection with apothecaries and nurses, they are informed of all the private occurrences in each family, and therefore enabled to gratify the rancour of malice, amuse the spleen of peevish indisposition, and entertain the eagerness of impertinent curiosity. In the course of these occupations, which frequently affected the reputation of our two adventurers, this whole body fell under the displeasure of our hero, who, after divers consultations with his friend, concerted a stratagem, which was practised upon the faculty in this manner. Among those who frequented the pump room was an old officer, whose temper, naturally impatient, was, by repeated attacks of the gout, which had almost deprived him of the use of his limbs, sublimated into a remarkable degree of virulence and perverseness. He imputed the inveteracy of his distemper to the malpractice of a surgeon who had administered to him, while he laboured under the consequences of an unfortunate amour; and this supposition had inspired him with an insurmountable antipathy to all the professors of the medical art, which was more and more confirmed by the information of a friend at London, who had told him that it was the common practice among the physicians at Bath to dissuade their patients from drinking the water, that the cure, and in consequence their attendance, might be longer protracted. Thus prepossessed, he had come to Bath, and, conformable to a few general instructions he had received, used the waters without any farther direction, taking all occasions of manifesting his hatred and contempt of the sons of Aesculapius, both by speech and gesticulations, and even by pursuing a regimen quite contrary to that which he knew they prescribed to others who seemed to be in exactly his condition. But he did not find his account in this method, how successful soever it may have been in other cases. His complaints, instead of vanishing, were every day more and more enraged, and at length he was confined to his bed, where he lay blaspheming from morn till night, and from night to morn, though still more determined than ever to adhere to his former maxims. In the midst of his torture, which was become the common joke of the town, being circulated through the industry of the physicians, who triumphed in his disaster, Peregrine, by means of Mr. Pipes, employed a country fellow, who had come to market, to run with great haste, early one morning, to the lodgings of all the doctors in town, and desire them to attend the colonel with all imaginable despatch. In consequence of this summons, the whole faculty put themselves in motion, and three of the foremost arriving at the same instant of time, far from complimenting one another with the door, each separately essayed to enter, and the whole triumvirate stuck in the passage. While they remained thus wedged together, they descried two of their brethren posting towards the same goal, with all the speed that God had enabled them to exert, upon which they came to a parley, and agreed to stand by one another. This covenant being made, they disentangled themselves, and inquiring about the patient, were told by the servant that he had just fallen asleep. Having received this intelligence, they took possession of the antechamber, and shut the door, while the rest of the tribe posted themselves on the outside as they arrived, so that the whole passage was filled from the top of the staircase to the street door, and the people of the house, together with the colonel's servant, struck dumb with astonishment. The three leaders of this learned gang had no sooner made their lodgment good than they began to consult about the patient's malady, which every one of them pretended to have considered with great care and assiduity. The first, who gave his opinion, said the distemper was an obstinate arthritis. The second affirmed that it was no other than a confirmed pox, and the third swore it was an inveterate scurvy. This diversity of opinions was supported by a variety of quotations from medical authors, ancient as well as modern, but these were not of sufficient authority, or at least not explicit enough to decide the dispute; for there are many schisms in medicine as well as in religion, and each sect can quote the fathers in support of the tenets they profess. In short, the contention rose to such a pitch of clamour as not only alarmed the brethren on the stair, but also awaked the patient from the first nap he had enjoyed in the space of 10 whole days. Had it been simply waking, he would have been obliged to them for the noise that disturbed him, for in that case he would have been relieved from the tortures of hell fire, to which, in his dreams, he fancied himself exposed. But this dreadful vision had been the result of that impression which was made upon his brain by the intolerable anguish of his joints, so that when he awaked, the pain, instead of being allayed, was rather aggravated by a great acuteness of sensation; and the confused vociferation in the next room invading his ears at the same time, he began to think his dream was realized, and in the pangs of despair applied himself to a bell that stood by his bedside, which he rung with great violence and perseverance. This alarm put an immediate stop to the disputation of the three doctors, who, upon this notice of his being awake, rushed into his chamber without ceremony, and two of them seizing his arms, the third made the like application to one of his temples. Before the patient could recollect himself from the amazement which had laid hold on him at this unexpected irruption, the room was filled by the rest of the faculty, who followed the servant that entered in obedience to his master's call, and the bed was in a moment surrounded by these gaunt ministers of death. The colonel, seeing himself beset with such an assemblage of solemn visages and figures, which he had always considered with the utmost detestation and abhorrence, was incensed to a most inexpressible degree of indignation, and so inspirited by his rage, that though his tongue denied its office, his other limbs performed their functions. He disengaged himself from the triumvirate, who had taken possession of his body, sprung out of bed with incredible agility, and seizing one of his crutches, applied it so effectually to one of the three, just as he stooped to examine the patient's water, that his tie periwig dropped into the pot, while he himself fell motionless on the floor. This significant explanation disconcerted the whole fraternity, every man turned his face, as if it were by instinct, towards the door, and the retreat of the community being obstructed by the efforts of individuals, confusion and tumultuous uproar ensued. For the colonel, far from limiting his prowess to the first exploit, handled his weapon with astonishing vigour and dexterity, without respect of persons, so that few or none of them had escaped without marks of his displeasure, when his spirits failed, and he sank down again quite exhausted on his bed. Favoured by this respite, the discomfited faculty collected their hats and wigs, which had fallen off in the fray, and perceiving the assailant too much enfeebled to renew the attack, set up their throats together, and loudly threatened to prosecute him severely for such an outrageous assault. By this time the landlord had interposed, and inquiring into the cause of the disturbance, was informed of what had happened by the complainants, who, at the same time, giving him to understand that they had been severally summoned to attend the colonel that morning, he assured them that they had been imposed upon by some wag, for his lodger had never dreamed of consulting any one of their profession. Thunderstruck at this declaration, the general clamour instantaneously ceased, and each in particular, at once comprehending the nature of the joke, they sneaked silently off with the loss they had sustained, in unutterable shame and mortification, while Peregrine and his friend, who took care to be passing that way by accident, made a full stop at sight of such an extraordinary efflux, and enjoyed the countenance and condition of every one as he appeared, nay, even made up to some of those who seemed most affected with their situation, and mischievously tormented them with questions touching this unusual congregation. Then, in consequence of the information they received from the landlord and the colonel's valet, subjected the sufferers to the ridicule of all the company in town. As it would have been impossible for the authors of this farce to keep themselves concealed from the indefatigable inquiries of the physicians, they made no secret of their having directed the whole, though they took care to own it in such an ambiguous manner as afforded no handle of prosecution. End of chapter 70. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 71 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1, by Tobias Smollett. Chapter 71. Peregrine humbles a noted Hector, and meets with a strange character at the house of a certain lady. Among those who never failed to reside at Bath during the season was a certain person who, from the most abject misery, had, by his industry and art at play, amassed about £15,000, and though his character was notorious, insinuated himself so far into the favour of what is called the best company, that very few private parties of pleasure took place in which he was not principally concerned. He was of a gigantic stature, a most intrepid countenance, and his disposition, naturally overbearing, had in the course of his adventures and success acquired a most intolerable degree of insolence and vanity. By the ferocity of his features and audacity of his behaviour, he had obtained a reputation for the most undaunted courage, which had been confirmed by divers adventures in which he had humbled the most assuming heroes of his own fraternity, so that now he reigned chief Hector of the place with unquestioned authority. With this son of fortune was Peregrine one evening engaged at play, and so successful that he could not help informing his friend of his good luck, Godfrey, hearing the description of the loser, immediately recognised the person whom he had known at Tunbridge, and assuring Pickle that he was a sharper of the first water, cautioned him against any further connection with such a dangerous companion, who, he affirmed, had suffered him to win a small sum, that he might be encouraged to lose a much greater sum upon some other occasion. Our young gentleman treasured up this advice, and though he did not scruple to give the gamester an opportunity of retrieving his loss, when he next day demanded his revenge, he absolutely refused to proceed after he had refunded his winning. The other, who considered him as a hot-headed, unthinking youth, endeavoured to inflame his pride to a continuance of the game, by treating his skill with scorn and contempt, and, among other sarcastic expressions, advised him to go to school again, before he proceeded to engage with masters of the art. Our hero, incensed at his arrogance, replied with great warmth, that he knew himself sufficiently qualified for playing with men of honour, who deal upon the square, and hoped he should always deem it infamous either to learn or practise the tricks of a professed gamester. "Blood and thunder, meaning me, sir," cried this artist, raising his voice, and curling his visage into a most intimidating frown. "Zounds! I'll cut the throat of any scoundrel who has the presumption to suppose that I don't play as honourably as e'er a nobleman in the kingdom; and I insist upon an explanation from you, sir, or, by hell and brimstone, I shall expect other sort of satisfaction." Peregrine, whose blood by this time boiled within him, answered without hesitation, "Far from thinking your demand unreasonable, I will immediately explain myself without reserve, and tell you that upon unquestionable authority I believe you to be an impudent rascal and common cheat." The Hector was so amazed and confounded at the freedom of this declaration, which he thought no man on earth would venture to make in his presence, that for some minutes he could not recollect himself, but at length whispered a challenge in the ear of our hero, which was accordingly accepted. When they arrived next morning upon the field, the gamester, arming his countenance with all its terrors, advanced with a sword of a monstrous length, and putting himself in a posture, called aloud in a most terrific voice, "Draw, damn ye, draw! I will this instant send you to your fathers." The youth was not slow in complying with his desire, and he began the attack with such unexpected spirit and address, that his adversary, having made shift with great difficulty to parry the first pass, retreated a few paces, and demanded a parley, in which he endeavoured to persuade the young man that to lay a man of his character under the necessity of chastising his insolence was the most rash and inconsiderate step that he could possibly have taken, but that he had compassion upon his youth, and was willing to spare him if he would surrender his sword, and promise to ask pardon in public for the offence he had given. Pickle was so much exasperated at this unparalleled effrontery, that without deigning to make the least reply, he flung his own hat in the proposer's face, and renewed the charge with such undaunted agility, that the gamester, finding himself in manifest hazard of his life, betook himself to his heels, and fled homeward with incredible speed, being closely pursued by Peregrine, who, having sheathed his sword, pelted him with stones as he ran, and compelled him to go that same day into banishment from Bath, where he had domineered so long. By this achievement, which was the subject of astonishment to all the company, who had looked upon the fugitive as a person of heroic courage, our adventurer's reputation was rendered formidable in all its circumstances, although he thereby disobliged a good many people of fashion, who had contracted an intimacy of friendship with the exile, and who resented his disgrace, as if it had been the misfortune of a worthy man. These generous patrons, however, bore a very small proportion to those who were pleased with the event of the duel, because in the course of their residence at Bath they had either been insulted or defrauded by the challenger. Nor was this instance of our hero's courage unacceptable to the ladies, few of whom could now resist the united force of such accomplishments. Indeed, neither he nor his friend Godfrey would have found much difficulty in picking up an agreeable companion for life. But Gauntlet's heart was pre-engaged to Sophy, and Pickle, exclusive of his attachment to Emily, which was stronger than he himself imagined, possessed such a share of ambition as could not be satisfied with the conquest of any female he beheld at Bath. His visits were therefore promiscuous, without any other view than that of amusement; and though his pride was flattered by the advances of the fair, whom he had captivated, he never harboured one thought of proceeding beyond the limits of common gallantry, and carefully avoided all particular explanations. But what above all other enjoyments yielded him the most agreeable entertainment was the secret history of characters, which he learned from a very extraordinary person, with whom he became acquainted in this manner. Being at the house of a certain lady on a visiting day, he was struck with the appearance of an old man, who no sooner entered the room than the mistress of the house very kindly desired one of the wits present to roast the old put. This petit maître, proud of the employment, went up to the senior, who had something extremely peculiar and significant in his countenance, and saluting him with divers fashionable congés, accosted him in these words: "Your servant, you old rascal. I hope to have the honour of seeing you hanged. I vow to Gad, you look extremely shocking, with those gummy eyes, lantern jaws, and toothless chaps. What, you squint at the ladies, you old rotten meddler? Yes, we understand your ogling, but you must content yourself with a cook maid, sink me. I see you want to sit. These withered shanks of yours tremble under their burden, but you must have a little patience, old Herco. Indeed you must. I intend to mortify you a little longer, curse me." The company was so tickled with this address, which was delivered with much grimace and gesticulation, that they burst out into a loud fit of laughter, which they fathered upon a monkey that was chained in the room; and when the peal was over, the wit renewed the attack in these words: "I suppose you are fool enough to think this mirth was occasioned by Pug. Ay, there he is, you had best survey him, he is of your own family, switch me. But the laugh was at your expense, and you ought to thank heaven for making you so ridiculous." While he uttered these ingenious ejaculations, the old gentleman bowed alternately to him and the monkey, that seemed to grin and chatter in imitation of the beau, and with an arch solemnity of visage, pronounced: "Gentlemen, as I have not the honour to understand your compliments, they will be much better bestowed on each other." So saying, he seated himself, and had the satisfaction to see the laugh returned upon the aggressor, who remained confounded and abashed, and in a few minutes left the room, muttering as he retired, "The old fellow grows scurrilous, stap my breath." While Peregrine wondered in silence at this extraordinary scene, the lady of the house, perceiving his surprise, gave him to understand that the ancient visitant was utterly bereft of the sense of hearing, that his name was Cadwallader Crabtree, his disposition altogether misanthropical, and that he was admitted into company on account of entertainment he afforded by his sarcastic observations, and the pleasant mistakes to which he was subject from his infirmity. Nor did our hero wait a long time for an illustration of this odd character. Every sentence he spoke was replete with gall, nor did his satire consist in general reflections, but a series of remarks which had been made through the medium of a most whimsical peculiarity of opinion. Among those who were present at this assembly was a young officer, who, having by dint of interest obtained a seat in the lower house, thought it incumbent upon him to talk of affairs of state, and accordingly regaled the company with an account of a secret expedition which the French were busied in preparing, assuring them that he had it from the mouth of the minister, to whom it had been transmitted by one of his agents abroad. In descanting upon the particulars of the armament, he observed that they had 20 ships of the line ready manned and victualled at Brest, which were destined for Toulon, where they would be joined by as many more, and from thence proceed to the execution of their scheme, which he imparted as a secret not fit to be divulged. This piece of intelligence being communicated to all the company, except Mr. Crabtree, who suffered by his loss of hearing, that cynic was soon after accosted by a lady, who, by means of an artificial alphabet, formed by a certain conjunction and disposition of the fingers, asked if he had heard any extraordinary news of late. Cadwallader, with his usual complaisance, replied that he supposed she took him for a courier or spy, by teasing him eternally with that question. He then expatiated upon the foolish curiosity of mankind, which, he said, must either proceed from idleness or want of ideas, and repeated almost verbatim the officer's information, a vague, ridiculous report invented by some ignorant coxcomb, who wanted to give himself airs of importance, and believed only by those who were utterly unacquainted with the politics and strength of the French nation. In confirmation of what he had advanced, he endeavoured to demonstrate how impossible it must be for that people to fit out even the third part of such a navy, so soon after the losses they had sustained during the war, and confirmed his proof by asserting that to his certain knowledge the harbours of Brest and Toulon could not at that time produce a squadron of 8 ships of the line. The member, who was an utter stranger to this misanthrope, hearing his own asseverations treated with such contempt, glowed with confusion and resentment, and, raising his voice, began to defend his own veracity with great eagerness and trepidation, mingling with his arguments many blustering invectives against the insolence and ill manners of his supposed contradictor, who sat with the most mortifying composure of countenance, till the officer's patience was quite exhausted, and then, to the manifest increase of his vexation, he was informed that his antagonist was so deaf, that, in all probability, the last trumpet would make no impression upon him without a previous renovation of his organs. End of chapter 71. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 72 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, by Tobias Smollett. Chapter 72. He cultivates an acquaintance with the misanthrope, who favours him with a short sketch of his own history. Peregrine was extremely well pleased with this occasional rebuke, which occurred so seasonably that he could scarce believe it accidental. He looked upon Cadwallader as the greatest curiosity he had ever known, and cultivated the old man's acquaintance with such insinuating address, that in less than a fortnight he obtained his confidence. As they one day walked into the fields together, the man-hater disclosed himself in these words: "Though the term of our communication has been but short, you must have perceived that I treat you with uncommon marks of regard, which, I assure you, is not owing to your personal accomplishments, nor the pains you take to oblige me. For the first I overlook, and the last I see through. but there is something in your disposition which indicates a rooted contempt for the world, and I understand you have made some successful efforts in exposing one part of it to the ridicule of the other. It is upon this assurance that I offer you my advice and assistance in prosecuting other schemes of the same nature. And to convince you that such an alliance is not to be rejected, I will now give you a short sketch of my history, which will be published after my death in 47 volumes of my own compiling. I was born about 40 miles from this place, of parents who, having a very old family name to support, bestowed their whole fortune on my elder brother, so that I inherited of my father little else than a large share of choler, to which I am indebted for a great many adventures that did not always end to my satisfaction. At the age of 18 I was sent up to town, with a recommendation to a certain peer, who found means to amuse me with the promise of a commission for 7 whole years; and 'tis odds but I should have made my fortune by my perseverance, had I not been arrested, and thrown into the Marshalsea by my landlord, on whose credit I had subsisted 3 years, after my father had renounced me as an idle vagabond. There I remained 6 months, among those prisoners who have no other support than chance charity, and contracted a very valuable acquaintance, which was of great service to me in the future emergencies of my life. I was no sooner discharged, in consequence of an act of parliament for the relief of insolvent debtors, than I went to the house of my creditor, whom I cudgelled without mercy, and that I might leave nothing undone of those things which I ought to have done, my next stage was to Westminster Hall, where I waited until my patron came forth from the house, and saluted him with a blow that laid him senseless on the pavement. But my retreat was not so fortunate as I could have wished. The chairman and lackeys in waiting having surrounded and disarmed me in a trice, I was committed to Newgate, and loaded with chains; and a very sagacious gentleman, who was afterwards hanged, having sat in judgment upon my case, pronounced me guilty of a capital crime, and foretold my condemnation at the Old Bailey. His prognostic, however, was disappointed, for nobody appearing to prosecute me at the next session, I was discharged by order of the court. It would be impossible for me to recount, in the compass of one day's conversation, all the particular exploits of which I bore considerable share. Suffice it to say, I have been at different times prisoner in all the jails within the bills of mortality. I have broken from every roundhouse on this side Temple Bar. No bailiff in the days of my youth and desperation durst execute a writ upon me without a dozen of followers, and the justices themselves trembled when I was brought before them. I was once maimed by a carman, with whom I quarrelled, because he ridiculed my leek on St. David's day. My skull was fractured by a butcher's cleaver on the like occasion. I have been run through the body 5 times, and lost the tip of my left ear by a pistol bullet. In a rencontre of this kind, having left my antagonist for dead, I was wise enough to make my retreat into France, and a few days after my arrival at Paris, entering into conversation with some officers on the subject of politics, a dispute arose, in which I lost my temper, and spoke so irreverently of the grand monarque, that next morning I was sent to the Bastille, by virtue of a lettre de cachet. There I remained for some months, deprived of all intercourse with rational creatures; a circumstance for which I was not sorry, as I had the more time to project schemes of revenge against the tyrant who confined me, and the wretch who had betrayed my private conversation. But tired at length with these fruitless suggestions, I was fain to unbend the severity of my thoughts by a correspondence with some industrious spiders, who had hung my dungeon with their ingenious labours. I considered their work with such attention that I soon became an adept in the mystery of weaving, and furnished myself with as many useful observations and reflections on that art as will compose a very curious treatise, which I intend to bequeath to the Royal Society for the benefit of our woollen manufacture; and this with a view to perpetuate my own name rather than befriend my country, for, thank heaven, I am weaned from all attachments of that kind, and look upon myself as one very little obliged to any society whatsoever. Although I presided with absolute power over this long-legged community, and distributed punishments and rewards to each, according to his deserts, I grew impatient of my situation, and my natural disposition one day prevailing, like a fire which had long been smothered, I wreaked the fury of my indignation upon my innocent subjects, and in a twinkling destroyed the whole race. While I was employed in this general massacre, the turnkey, who brought me food, opened the door, and perceiving my transport, shrugged up his shoulders, and leaving my allowance, went out, pronouncing, "Le pauvre diable, la tête lui tourne." My passion no sooner subsided than I resolved to profit by this opinion of the jailor, and from that day counterfeited lunacy, with such success, that in less than 3 months I was delivered from the Bastille, and sent to the galleys, in which they thought my bodily vigour might be of service, although the faculties of my mind were decayed. Before I was chained to the oar, I received 300 stripes by way of welcome, that I might thereby be rendered more tractable, notwithstanding I used all the arguments in my power to persuade them I was only mad north-north-west, and when the wind was southerly knew a hawk from a handsaw. In our second cruise we had the good fortune to be overtaken by a tempest, during which the slaves were unbound, that they might contribute the more to the preservation of the galley, and have a chance for their lives in case of shipwreck. We were no sooner at liberty, than making ourselves masters of the vessel, we robbed the officers, and ran her on shore among rocks on the coast of Portugal; from whence I hastened to Lisbon, with a view of obtaining my passage in some ship bound for England, where by this time I hoped my affair was forgotten. But before this scheme could be accomplished, my evil genius led me into company, and being intoxicated, I began to broach doctrines on the subject of religion, at which some of the party were scandalized and incensed, and I was next day dragged out of bed by the officers of the Inquisition, and conveyed to a cell in the prison belonging to that tribunal. At my first examination, my resentment was strong enough to support me under the torture, which I endured without flinching; but my resolution abated, and my zeal immediately cooled, when I understood from a fellow prisoner, who groaned on the other side of the partition, that in a short time there would be an auto da fe, in consequence of which I should in all probability be doomed to the flames, if I would not renounce my heretical errors, and submit to such penance as the church should think fit to prescribe. This miserable wretch was convicted of Judaism, which he had privately practised by connivance for many years, until he had amassed a fortune sufficient to attract the regard of the church. To this he fell a sacrifice, and accordingly prepared himself for the stake, while I, not at all ambitious of the crown of martyrdom, resolved to temporize, so that when I was brought to the question the second time, I made a solemn recantation. As I had no worldly fortune to obstruct my salvation, I was received into the bosom of the church, and by way of penance enjoined to walk barefoot to Rome in the habit of a pilgrim. During my peregrination through Spain, I was detained as a spy, until I could procure credentials from the Inquisition at Lisbon, and behaved with such resolution and reserve, that after being released, I was deemed a proper person to be employed in quality of a secret intelligencer at a certain court. This office I undertook without hesitation, and being furnished with money and bills of credit, crossed the Pyrenees, with intention to revenge myself upon the Spaniards for the severities I had undergone during my captivity. Having therefore effectually disguised myself by a change of dress, and a large patch on one eye, I hired an equipage, and appeared at Bologna in quality of an itinerant physician, in which capacity I succeeded tolerably well, till my servants decamped in the night with my baggage, and left me in the condition of Adam. In short, I have travelled over the greatest part of Europe as a beggar, pilgrim, priest, soldier, gamester, and quack, and felt the extremes of indigence and opulence, with the inclemency of weather in all its vicissitudes. I have learned that the characters of mankind are everywhere the same, that common sense and honesty bear an infinitely small proportion to folly and vice, and that life is at best a paltry province. After having suffered innumerable hardships, dangers, and disgraces, I returned to London, where I lived some years in a garret, and picked up a subsistence, such as it was, by vending purges in the streets from the back of a pied horse, in which situation I used to harangue the mob in broken English, under pretence of being a high German doctor. At last an uncle died, by whom I inherited an estate of £300 per annum, though in his lifetime he would not have parted with a sixpence to save my soul and body from perdition. I now appear in the world not as a member of any community, or what is called a social creature, but merely as a spectator, who entertains himself with the grimaces of a jack-pudding, and banquets his spleen in beholding his enemies at loggerheads. That I may enjoy this disposition abstracted from all interruption, danger, and participation, I feign myself deaf, an expedient by which I not only avoid all disputes and their consequences, but also become master of 1,000 little secrets, which are every day whispered in my presence, without any suspicion of their being overheard. You saw how I handled that shallow politician at my Lady Plausible's the other day. The same method I practise upon the crazed Tory, the bigot Whig, the sour supercilious pedant, the petulant critic, the blustering coward, the fawning fool, the pert imp, sly sharper, and every other species of knaves and fools with which this kingdom abounds. In consequence of my rank and character, I obtain free admission to the ladies, among whom I have acquired the appellation of the Scandalous Chronicle. As I am considered, while silent, in no other light than that of a footstool or elbow chair, they divest their conversation of all restraint before me, and gratify my sense of hearing with strange things, which, if I could prevail upon myself to give the world that satisfaction, would compose a curious piece of secret history, and exhibit a quite different idea of characters from what is commonly entertained. By this time, young gentlemen, you may perceive that I have it in my power to be a valuable correspondent, and that it will be to your interest to deserve my confidence." Here the misanthrope left off speaking, desirous to know the sentiments of our hero, who embraced the proffered alliance in a transport of joy and surprise; and the treaty was no sooner concluded than Mr. Crabtree began to perform articles, by imparting to him 1,000 delicious secrets, from the possession of which he promised himself innumerable scenes of mirth and enjoyment. By means of this associate, whom he considered as the ring of Gyges, he foresaw that he should be enabled to penetrate not only into the chambers, but even to the inmost thoughts of the female sex. In order to ward off suspicion, they agreed to revile each other in public, and meet at a certain private rendezvous, to communicate their mutual discoveries, and concert their future operations. But soon after this agreement, our adventurer was summoned to the garrison by an express from his friend Hatchway, representing that the commodore lay at the point of death; and in less than an hour after the receipt of this melancholy piece of news, he set out post for his uncle's habitation, having previously taken leave of Crabtree, who promised to meet him in 2 months in London, and settled a correspondence with Gauntlet, who proposed to remain at Bath during the rest of the season. Chapter 72. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. Chapter 73 of the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1, by Tobias Smollett. Chapter 73. Peregrine arrives at the garrison, where he receives the last admonitions of Commodore Trunnion, who next day resigns his breath, and is buried according to his own directions. Some gentlemen in the country make a fruitless attempt to accommodate matters betwixt Mr. Gamaliel Pickle and his eldest son. About 4 o'clock in the morning, our hero arrived at the garrison, where he found his generous uncle in extremity, supported in bed by Julia on one side and Lieutenant Hatchway on the other, while Mr. Jolter administered spiritual consolation to his soul, and between whiles comforted Mistress Trunnion, who with her maid sat by the fire, weeping with great decorum, the physician having just taken his last fee and retired, after pronouncing the fatal prognostic, in which he anxiously wished he might be mistaken. Though the Commodore's speech was interrupted by a violent hiccup, he still retained the use of his senses, and when Peregrine approached, stretched out his hand with manifest signs of satisfaction. The young gentleman, whose heart overflowed with gratitude and affection, could not behold such a spectacle unmoved. He endeavoured to conceal his tenderness, which, in the wildness of his youth and the pride of his disposition, he considered as a derogation from his manhood. But in spite of all his endeavours, the tears gushed from his eyes while he kissed the old man's hand, and he was so utterly disconcerted by his grief, that when he attempted to speak, his tongue denied its office, so that the Commodore, perceiving his disorder, made a last effort of strength, and consoled him in these words: "Swab the spray from your bowsprit, my good lad, and coil up your spirits. You must not let the top lifts of your heart give way, because you see me ready to go down at these years. Many a better man has foundered before he has made half my way, though I trust, by the mercy of God, I shall be sure in port in a very few glasses, and fast moored in a most blessed riding. For my good friend Jolter hath overhauled the journal of my sins, and by the observation he hath taken of the state of my soul, I hope I shall happily conclude my voyage, and be brought up in the latitude of heaven. Here has been a doctor that wanted to stow me chock full of physic, but when a man's hour is come, what signifies his taking his departure with a apothecary's shop in his hold? Those fellows come alongside of dying men like the messengers of the Admiralty with sailing orders. But I told him as how I could slip my cable without his direction or assistance, and so he hauled off in dudgeon. This
cursed hiccup make such a rippling in the current of my speech, that mayhap you don't understand what I say. Now, while the sucker of my wind-pump will go, I would willingly mention a few things, which I hope you will set down in the log-book of your remembrance when I am stiff, d'ye see. There's your aunt sitting whimpering by the fire. I desire you will keep her tight, warm, and easy in her old age. She's an honest heart in her own way, and though she goes a little crank and humoursome by being often overstowed with nonce and religion, she has been a faithful shipmate to me, and I dare say she never turned in with another man since we first embarked in the same bottom. Jack Hatchway, you know the trim of her as well as e'er a man in England, and I believe she has a kindness for you, whereby if you two will grapple in the way of matrimony when I am gone, I do suppose that my godson, for love of me, will allow you to live in the garrison all the days of your life.
Peregrine assured him he would with pleasure comply with any request he should make in behalf of two persons he esteemed so much. The lieutenant, with a waggish sneer, which even the gravity of the situation could not prevent, thanked them both for their good will, telling the commodore he was obliged to him for his friendship, in seeking to promote him to the command of a vessel which he himself had worn out in the service; but that, notwithstanding, he should be content to take charge of her, though he could not help being shy of coming after such an able navigator. Trunnion, exhausted as he was, smiled at this sally, and after some pause resumed his admonitions in this manner.
I need not talk of Pipes, because I know you'll do for him without any recommendation. The fellow has sailed with me in many a hard gale, and I'll warrant him as stout a seaman as ever set face to the weather. But I hope you'll take care of the rest of my crew, and not disrate them after I am dead in favour of new followers. As for that young woman, Ned Gauntlet's daughter, I'm informed as how she's an excellent wench, and has a respect for you, whereby if you run her on board in an unlawful way, I leave my curse upon you, and trust you will never prosper in the voyage of life. But I believe you are more of an honest man than to behave so much like a pirate. I beg of all love you will take care of your constitution, and beware of running foul of harlots, who are no better than so many mermaids that sit upon rocks in the sea, and hang out a fair face for the destruction of passengers. Though I must say, for my own part, I never met with any of those sweet singers, and yet I have gone to sea for the space of 30 years. But howsomever, steer your course clear of all such brimstone bitches. Shun going to law, as you would shun the devil, and look upon all attorneys as devouring sharks, or ravenous fishes of prey. As soon as the breath is out of my body, let minute guns be fired, till I am safe underground. I would also be buried in the red jacket I had on when I boarded and took the Renummy. Let my pistols, cutlass, and pocket compass be laid in the coffin along with me. Let me be carried to the grave by my own men, rigged in the black caps and white shirts which my barge's crew were wont to wear, and they must keep a good look out, that none of your pilfering rascallions may come and heave me up again for the lucre of what they can get, until the carcass is belayed by a tombstone. As for the motto, or what you call it, I leave that to you and Mr. Jolter, who are scholars, but I do desire that it may not be engraved in the Greek or Latin lingos, and much less in the French, which I abominate, but in plain English, that when the angel comes to pipe all hands at the great day, he may know that I am a British man, and speak to me in my mother tongue. And now I have no more to say, but God in heaven have mercy upon my soul, and send you all fair weather wheresoever you are bound.
So saying, he regarded every individual around him with a look of complacency, and, closing his eye, composed himself to rest, while the whole audience, Pipes himself not excepted, were melted with sorrow, and Mrs. Trunnion consented to quit the room, that she might not be exposed to the unspeakable anguish of seeing him expire. His last moments, however, were not so near as they imagined. He began to doze, and enjoyed small intervals of ease, till next day in the afternoon, during which remissions he was heard to pour forth many pious ejaculations, expressing his hope that, for all the heavy cargo of his sins, he should be able to surmount the puttock shrouds of despair, and get aloft to the cross-trees of God's good favour. At last his voice sunk so low as not to be distinguished, and having lain about an hour, almost without any perceptible signs of life, he gave up the ghost, with a groan which announced his decease. Julia was no sooner certified of this melancholy event than she ran to her aunt's chamber, weeping aloud, and immediately a very decent concert was performed by the good widow and her attendants. Peregrine and Hatchway retired till the corpse should be laid out, and Pipes, having surveyed the body with a face of rueful attention, "Well fare thy soul, old Hawser Trunnion," said he. "Man and boy, I have known thee these 35 years, and sure, a truer heart never broke biscuit. Many a hard gale hast thou weathered, but now thy spells are all over, and thy hull fairly laid up. A better commander I'd never desired to serve, and who knows but I may help to set up thy standing rigging in another world." All the servants of the house were affected with the loss of their old master, and the poor people in the neighbourhood assembled at the gate, and by repeated howlings expressed their sorrow for the death of their charitable benefactor. Peregrine, though he felt everything which love and gratitude could inspire on this occasion, was not so much overwhelmed with affliction as to be incapable of taking the management of the family into his own hands. He gave directions about the funeral with great discretion, after having paid the compliments of condolence to his aunt, whom he consoled with the assurance of his inviolable esteem and affection. He ordered a suit of mourning to be made for every person in the garrison, and invited all the neighbouring gentlemen to the burial, not even excepting his father and brother Gam, who did not, however, honour the ceremony with their presence, nor was his mother humane enough to visit her sister-in-law in her distress. In the method of interment, the Commodore's injunctions were obeyed to a title, and at the same time our hero made a donation of £50 to the poor of the parish, as a benefaction which his uncle had forgot to bequeath. Having performed these obsequies with the most pious punctuality, he examined the will, to which there was no addition since it had first been executed, adjusted the payment of all the legacies, and, being sole executor, took an account of the estate to which he had succeeded, which, after all deductions, amounted to £30,000. The possession of such a fortune, of which he was absolute master, did not at all contribute to the humiliation of his spirit, but inspired him with new ideas of grandeur and magnificence, and elevated his hope to the highest pinnacle of expectation. His domestic affairs being settled, he was visited by almost all the gentlemen of the county, who came to pay their compliments of congratulation on his accession to the estate, and some of them offered their good offices towards a reconciliation betwixt his father and him, induced by the general detestation which was entertained for his brother Gam, who was by this time looked upon by his neighbours as a prodigy of insolence and malice. Our young squire thanked them for their kind proposal, which he accepted, and old Gamaliel, at their entreaties, seemed very well disposed to any accommodation; but as he would not venture to declare himself before he had consulted his wife, his favourable disposition was rendered altogether ineffectual by the instigations of that implacable woman; and our hero resigned all expectation of being reunited to his father's house. His brother, as usual, took all opportunities of injuring his character by false aspersions and stories misrepresented in order to prejudice his reputation; nor was his sister Julia suffered to enjoy her good fortune in peace. Had he undergone such persecution from an alien to his blood, the world would have heard of his revenge; but, notwithstanding his indignation, he was too much tinctured by the prejudices of consanguinity to lift his arm in judgment against the son of his own parents, and this consideration abridged the term of his residence at the garrison, where he had proposed to stay for some months. Chapter 73. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey. The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 1, by Tobias Smollett.